for a treaty, you would need two-thirds approval positively by our Senate. And that's sometimes hard to get. So this is, in a way, to get around that requirement. But of course, that is the practical consequence of this distinction. But some lawyers actually have thought that this is not constitutional, but our courts have not accepted that kind of challenge.
Now, is this a rarely used tool where NAFTA is one of these agreements, or is it used routinely in the treaty-making process?
We have, of course, genuine treaties, but quite often when you need to get something done fast, but at the same time include Congress, you follow this track. And therefore, this is actually more frequently used than people might think.
Now, a treaty is the highest law of the land, according to our Constitution, that a treaty is more powerful than whatever domestic law you have. Is the same true of this type of agreement?
Well, the agreement is binding, and NAFTA, for those who actually have bothered to look, is quite a few hundred pages of densely written prose. Even some of the supporters of NAFTA probably did not read through all the pages. But once it has been accepted by the President and by the Congress of this country, yeah, the agreement is binding.
Okay. Now, NAFTA, I remember during the early 90s, there was a lot of debate about whether NAFTA was a good idea or a bad idea. I don't really remember all the nuances of the debate back then, but after 12 years of effect, is there any kind of consensus about whether it's been good for the United States, Canada, and Mexico, or bad?
That's a very interesting question. Actually, if we reflect back, we know that there was no general consensus then in any of the countries, although within the administrative organs of these countries, clearly there was support, which got it through. But there are lots of questions. Today also, there is a lot of dissensus. So there is no consensus today, I would say, and probably more questions are being asked today than they were even then.
Now, are those questions coming equally from all three countries, or are any of the countries feeling like, NAFTA has been good for us to the detriment maybe of somebody else?
I think you have the questions being raised in all the countries, but I think in Canada and Mexico, even people within the government are raising many uncomfortable questions and are scratching their collective heads, wondering what really went wrong. Whereas in the US, within the establishment, I think there is more support even today for it, but the same kind of support does not exist among the organized labor, environmental groups, social justice groups, and many other groups in our civil society.
Now, what was the intended purpose of NAFTA? I understand that it was supposed to remove tariffs, but what was the goal thought would come of that?
That is a very intriguing question because ostensibly NAFTA is really about trade liberalization, and there is clearly a part of NAFTA, maybe the main part of NAFTA, that does that. But in addition, NAFTA has other parts that are very different from standard trade agreements. Prior to WTO, I think NAFTA is, in a way, an example of a trade agreement that goes way beyond just trade and includes other issues as well.
Right. Now, so the thought was, you remove the borders of trade between Canada, the United States, and Mexico, and goods can flow freely through. Was there I don't know if this is true or not, but was there a thought that it would tie our three economies together?
That certainly was an idea that people thought would be a good one. The supporters thought that it would increase trade, flow of goods and services, that would make goods cheaper for people and more readily available. Business would benefit, and the governments would also come closer together. So on economic and political grounds, the supporters certainly thought it was a very good idea.
Now, is the EU being operated on that sort of model? where it's just, hey, we're going to remove all these internal barriers. And I don't mean to throw you an EU question if it's not on your plate of expertise.
No, that's fine. That's fine.
But that, you know, you remove all these internal tariffs and you convert to the same monetary units and you just reduce all the costs?
As far as I can tell, the EU really was not in people's mind. If we go back to the history a little bit, before we had NAFTA, there was a free trade agreement between Canada and the United States in 1989. And NAFTA came around actually end of 1993, probably, if I'm not mistaken, the actual date was 1st of January 1994. So it was supposed to be what technically economists would call a customs union. But as I already have observed, it goes way beyond customs union. EU is a much broader kind of and much more ambitious kind of idea because it started out as European Common Market way back in the 50s and the Treaty of Rome that established it was a treaty, properly speaking. But then they moved, as you observed, step by step towards closer monetary integration even, and with Maastricht Treaty they have moved further, and now of course we have a quasi-political entity called the European Union, which is now being extended. So NAFTA, even today, as far as I can tell, does not have that kind of ambition.
Right, and and there's no aspiration in that direction,
right,
I would guess.
Right.
Now, what's the connection between NAFTA and, say, the current immigration debate that we're seeing, and how are those two things influencing each other?
Well, somebody said that the world is full of unintended consequences. I do not think that the intention of people who supported NAFTA was ever to actually worsen the immigration problem between Mexico and the United States in particular. The idea was that as Mexico grew more rapidly because of NAFTA, among other things, the problem would be eased. But what actually happened, unfortunately, was that in the agricultural sector of Mexico in particular, the effect of free trade, which was, by the way, accompanied by the loosening of Mexican Constitution, the Article 27 of their 1917 Constitution gave special privileges and protections to small agriculture, especially the ejidos that were institutionalized during the Mexican Revolution and afterwards. Well, some of that actually was withdrawn, plus there was this increased competition, subsidized also by the US government. We subsidize our farmers quite a bit. Canada also does the same thing. So Mexican small farmers simply could not compete. And partly, but not entirely, I want to emphasize, as a consequence of NAFTA, more than 1 million farmers, Mexican farmers, small farmers, have been dispossessed. They have been forced out of their farms, and many of them can find jobs in the urban areas in Mexico, so at least some among them have joined this flow of undocumented workers in this country. So it's an unintended consequence, I think, but it is very real.
Now, if I understand correctly, one of the things that NAFTA gives companies the power to do is sue a government that does something that's anti-competitive. Is it possible that Mexican companies in the farming industry could sue the United States or Canada to say that your subsidies create an unfair trade situation for us? They effectively become a tariff on us?
That would be an interesting kind of trade issue. Now, let me just go back and point out something with regards to NAFTA. In some ways, NAFTA actually does something good, although this is controversial. Chapter 19 of NAFTA actually gives any of the signatories the right to actually go before a kind of bilateral commission rather than just deal with the unilateral trade agencies of the countries. So in a sense, this levels the playing field a little bit more for weaker countries like Mexico. But whether or not you can actually argue effectively that these subsidies are causing the kind of problem that you mentioned would be technically a huge problem for Mexicans in particular. It wouldn't be an open and shut case. And even after you have won, let's just say hypothetically, you could go to this commission, bilateral commission, make your case and win. It's not clear that U.S. actually would go by it because Canadian companies actually have done it. There is that famous Canadian soft lumber case. U.S. actually imposed 27% duty, and Canada claimed that it was unfair. And it won. The last time it had won, actually, is very recently, in March, just about a month ago. But U.S., it will be interesting to see if U.S. actually comes through. So far, our position has been that, well, you know, we think that you are dumping, so we are not going to change our stance, even though, regrettably, we lost.
All right. And I know that. I don't want to start peppering you with specific cases because I don't know how prepared you are to answer them, but there was a case in California, the MTBE company in Canada that makes the additive that goes into gas, and the state of California had a lot of problems with MTBE leaking out of containment tanks at gas stations and getting into the water supply, and after it had happened more than a dozen times, they finally said, okay, no more MTBE, and this Canadian company then sued the state of California for almost $1 billion, saying that you've hurt our ability to compete in the market. And things like that seem to have grown out of the NAFTA agreement.
Indeed. I think you're thinking of the Methanex Corporation from Canada. And this is a consequence of, well, not strictly speaking a consequence, but this is consistent with Chapter 11 of NAFTA, which does give the right to corporations in all three countries, actually, to bring suits of the sort that you just mentioned, that Methanex actually did against the state of California. And quite a few of these lawsuits are actually against the state and local governments, which don't have the kind of resources that our federal government does. But you could say that state of California probably has more resources than Mexico. So Mexico, I think, is a country that can least use this kind of provisions. Canada and U.S. being more wealthy, you know, U.S. has a per capita GDP of more than $42,000. Canada more than $31,000. Mexico is below $10,000 per capita, and U.S. economy is more than 5 times the size of Canada and Mexico combined. And Mexican economy is the poorest, the smallest, and the weakest politically also. So this provision can benefit powerful corporations in the U.S. and in Canada, but not so much Mexico.
Right. And it does seem somewhat anti-democratic in the way that it can operate, because even though California is one of the biggest and wealthiest states, still to be facing a $1 billion lawsuit, even the potential of losing that would tend to have a chilling effect on local governments. And if it was a city that was getting sued, or even smaller local government than a city, you can see how just filing the suit could start to impact the way that laws get passed.
Indeed, I think you're quite correct there. And it has other consequences too. In Canada, one of the companies which produces energy was going to supply one of the Canadian provinces, New Brunswick, which is, I think, just north of Maine, somewhat more cheaply than the price at which they are going to export. But U.S. actually objected, and they had to back off, and that hurt the Canadian consumers, clearly, in this case. Another Canadian company actually had to pay, another US-based company actually claimed compensation because Canada had banned toxic material like PCB Canada actually is signatory to a convention, Basel Convention. It may even be a treaty, international treaty, which bans that kind of cross-border hauling of dangerous materials. So Canada was really trying to live up to its own international obligations.
Right.
But as a consequence of NAFTA, or consistent with NAFTA, it was sued, and it had to pay, I think, $5 million or more as damages.
Yeah. Now, tell us more about these Chapter 11 cases. What is Chapter 11 of NAFTA, and then what kind of cases have been brought?
Well, we already mentioned quite a few of them. It is actually one of those trade-related, you might say, but really very different from usual customs union provisions. Usually, customs unions mean that you oblige yourselves, all the parties are obliged to take down tariff barriers, to convert quantitative restrictions, quotas, into nominal tariffs that can be easily spotted and then reduced eventually. And NAFTA clearly has that aspect. But in addition to that, you have this kind of provision which really gives the right to foreign corporations to sue local governments in the country where they are operating for perceived damages. And that actually is very novel and can be very damaging to local interests in many cases.
Right. Now, is that the identical type of procedure that's in place in bilateral investment treaties that the developed world signs with the developing world country to protect the assets of a corporation doing business there?
Of course, even more than bilateral kind of agreements which exist and which people you can see to some extent might need to do business in a reasonable way. So the questions would be about fine print of that, right. What's included, what's excluded, what's fair, what's not fair, and reasonable people may disagree about those things from time to time. But more ambitious attempt now is, of course, the multilateral agreement on investment, where the developed countries want a lot more rights which actually are perceived by the non-developed part as privileges and quite unreasonable demands in many ways. And that has run into a lot of problems. So these are, in a way, trade-related, but they are different from the normal course of trade, and they are controversial.
Okay. What do you think the future of NAFTA is going to be? Is it an agreement that you think is going to continue to develop and grow, and all three countries are going to grow to embrace it, or is it sowing the seeds of its own political demise as more and more people become concerned about it?
That's a very important question, I think, but also very difficult to answer because it involves the future. As Eugene Ionesco, the famous French playwright, once said in his play, The Rhinoceros, which is actually about fascism, that we can only know the future after it has happened. But I think we can conjecture to some extent. One Mexican economist actually commented, referring back to Hernan Cortez's burning of boats. I don't know if it is a real historical fact, but apparently he committed irrevocably himself and his cohort to being in Mexico. In a similar way, Mexico really has irretrievably committed itself to both NAFTA and globalization, and it seems unstoppable from this point of view. On the other hand, politics is something that involves many decision makers and, most importantly, people who are afflicted for a long time. And if you look at all these countries, but especially Mexico, you can